A silver pocket watch sat on the warden's desk at Fort Smith Prison, 1895. Dying outlaw's last possession. Engraved on the back, J.R. The warden read the final letter aloud. "Send to Bass Reeves. He'll understand." Bass received the package 3 days later, opened it alone in the Marshal's office, held the watch to lamplight, his brother James's initials. The memory hit. 1883, James shot dead during a stagecoach robbery near Muskogee. Bass spent 12 years hunting the man who did it. Caught him in '94. Testimony sealed the death sentence, but tuberculosis intervened. Now the killer sends the watch back with one word: sorry. Bass's hand shook. First sign of doubt in a 30-year career. The letter continued. "One favor, come to my burial." Why grant mercy to the man who destroyed everything? Bass Reeves wasn't born a legend. He became one through impossible choices. Born enslaved in 1838 in Crawford County, Arkansas, freed during the Civil War chaos, appointed Deputy U.S. Marshal in 1875 by Judge Isaac Parker himself. By 1895, the numbers were staggering. Over 3,000 arrests across Indian Territory. Master of disguise who could blend into Creek or Cherokee settlements. Fluent in multiple native languages. Known for bringing outlaws in alive when everyone expected shootouts. Fort Smith newspapers called him the most feared lawman in the West. But nobody knew about the silver watch. His brother James had carried it everywhere, family heirloom from their grandfather. When James died in 1883, the watch vanished with the killer. Bass carried 2 missions after that: uphold federal law and find his brother's murderer. The murder happened outside Muskogee on an August afternoon in 1883. James Reeves drove a stagecoach carrying timber payroll for Creek Nation contractors. 3 outlaws stopped the coach on a wooded road near the Canadian River. Witnesses later testified James fought back, reached for his Winchester rifle under the seat. One outlaw panicked, fired twice. James died bleeding on dirt, the silver watch still attached to his vest by a gold chain. The outlaws took $400 and the watch. Bass arrived 2 hours later from Fort Smith, knelt beside his brother's body in the dust, saw the broken chain, the empty space where the watch had hung. That night, Bass made a private vow. He'd find the shooter. Not revenge. Bass believed in law above personal feelings. But James deserved justice. The watch deserved to come home. The manhunt started quiet and methodical. Bass questioned informants in every settlement, tracked hold-up patterns, studied gang movements. 12 years of patient hunting. The capture finally came in Creek Nation territory during spring 1894. Bass tracked Jim Webb, a 30-year-old drifter with a record of robberies, to a hideout near Muskogee. No shootout. Webb saw Bass riding toward the cabin and walked out with hands raised. According to deputies who were there, Webb looked almost relieved. During the Fort Smith trial that summer, Bass testified with precision. Described the 1883 crime, identified Webb through witness statements and physical evidence, including the silver watch Webb still carried in his coat pocket after 11 years. The federal jury convicted in 40 minutes. Judge Parker sentenced Webb to hang. But before the execution date, Webb developed a persistent cough that wouldn't stop. Prison doctor examined him, diagnosed tuberculosis, advanced stage. Death was certain, just slower than the gallows. Webb spent his final months coughing blood in a Fort Smith cell, knowing Bass Reeves had brought him to justice for killing Bass's own brother. Bass opened the warden's package in his marshal's office, early March 1895. The watch and a folded letter. His hands had never shaken arresting killers or facing armed gangs, but holding James's watch after 12 years made his fingers tremble. The letter was brief, written in shaky handwriting. Marshal Reeves, I was 19 and stupid. Your brother begged me not to shoot. I see his face every night. This watch haunted me worse than any prison cell. I'm dying now from tuberculosis. One favor before I go, come to my burial. Let me say I'm sorry to your face. I don't deserve forgiveness. I just need you to know I carried this weight every single day. Bass read it 3 times. Sat alone in darkness for 2 hours while Fort Smith's usual frontier noise, horses, merchants, drunks arguing, continued outside. The watch ticked perfectly in his palm. Still worked after all these years, all that blood. Bass made his decision. Nobody expected what came next. Next morning, Bass saddled his horse and rode northwest without telling his deputies the destination, 80 miles to the territorial prison. He arrived at dusk, dust covering his coat. The warden met him at the iron gates, visibly surprised to see the famous Marshal. Marshal Reeves, I didn't think you'd actually come. Bass dismounted slowly, tied his horse. Jim Webb asked for me. Where is he? The warden's face showed understanding mixed with concern. He's in the infirmary wing, dying. Days left, maybe hours. You sure about this? Bass nodded once. The warden led him through stone corridors that reeked of sickness, sweat, and slow death. Guards stopped their card games to stare as Bass passed. Everyone in the territorial prison system knew the story. Bass Reeves tracking his brother's killer for over a decade, testifying at trial, watching the guilty verdict come down. Now the legendary Marshal was visiting that same killer's deathbed. Webb lay on a narrow cot in a dim cell, skeletal and pale, breathing in shallow gasps. Bass stood at the bars. Webb's eyes opened slowly, focused. You came. His voice was barely a whisper, throat destroyed by disease. Bass said nothing. Webb coughed, blood speckling his lips and chin. I was 19, Marshal. The gang threatened to kill my sister if I didn't ride with them that day. Your brother fought back when we stopped the coach. I panicked, just panicked. Pulled the trigger twice. Worst thing I ever did in my whole life. Silence filled the cell like water filling a well. Finally, Bass spoke, voice low and measured. You asked for a favor in your letter. Webb nodded weakly. Come to my burial. That's all I want. So someone witnesses what I became, what that one decision cost. Bass returned to Fort Smith next day, told nobody about the prison visit. That night, alone in his small house on the edge of town, he did something he hadn't done in years. Prayed. Not for guidance, not for strength. Just prayed into the silence. The silver watch sat on his wooden table. Candlelight made it glow like it was lit from inside. He thought about James, thought about Webb's haunted face, eaten hollow by guilt and tuberculosis. Thought about 12 years of hate that had kept him sharp and focused, driving him through impossible manhunts across the most dangerous territory in America. Hate kept me hunting, he said aloud to the empty room. But what now? Webb would die in days. The law had judged him guilty. Execution or disease, death was death either way. But Webb's request wasn't about the law. He wanted something the courtroom couldn't provide. A witness. Someone to acknowledge his regret. To see the weight he'd carried for 12 years. Bass realized something sitting there in candlelight. Forgiveness wasn't for Webb's benefit. It was to end his own torment. For 12 years, Bass had carried James's death like a millstone around his neck. The watch was back now. Justice had been served in court. But if he refused this dying request, he'd carry the hate until his own grave. The weight would never lift. I gave my word to hear him out. Bass whispered to the darkness. I'll keep it to the end. The decision settled into his bones. 3 days later, the telegram arrived from the prison warden. Webb was dead. Burial scheduled for March 14th in the Paupers' Cemetery. Bass would ride out to keep his promise. Bass told Deputy Floyd Wilson he'd be gone 2 days. Floyd frowned, suspicious. What's this about, Marshal? Bass folded the telegram and tucked it in his vest pocket. Keeping a promise. Floyd knew better than to push, but word spread fast through Fort Smith. Bass Reeves riding 80 miles to attend the burial of the man who murdered his brother. Some lawmen thought grief had broken his judgment. Others wondered if there was more to the story nobody knew. Bass didn't explain to anyone. He packed his bedroll and provisions, checked his rifle, though he wouldn't need it, made sure the silver watch was secure in his vest pocket, where James used to carry it. He left Fort Smith at dawn, riding hard across familiar Indian Territory trails he'd crossed 1,000 times chasing outlaws. This time felt completely different. Not hunting, not pursuing, just riding to witness an ending. The landscape rolled past. Oak forests, prairie grass, settlements where people recognized him and waved. Bass barely noticed. His mind kept returning to that cell, Webb's face, the desperation in his voice when he said, "I see your brother's face every night." Bass had spent 12 years imagining what he'd say if he ever caught James's killer. He'd rehearsed speeches in his head, imagined confrontations, pictured justice being served. None of those imagined scenarios included tears or forgiveness or burying family evidence in a killer's grave. But here he was, riding toward exactly that. The watch ticked against his chest with every horse stride. By the time Bass reached the prison grounds at dusk on March 14th, he still didn't know what he'd say at the graveside, if anything. Some things you can't rehearse. The Paupers' Cemetery sat on a hillside behind the territorial prison, unmarked graves scattered between scrub oak trees. Small gathering, prison chaplain, the warden, 2 guards acting as pallbearers. No family. Webb had no one left after 12 years in the outlaw life. The pine coffin rested beside an open grave. Rough lumber, no decoration or brass handles. Bass dismounted and tied his horse to a fence post. The warden nodded acknowledgement. "Marshal Reeves, surprised you made the ride." Bass said nothing, just approached the grave slowly. He pulled the silver watch from his vest pocket, held it in his weathered palm. Afternoon sunlight caught the engraved JR on the back, same light that had reflected off it 12 years ago when it hung on James's vest. The chaplain began a brief prayer about mercy and redemption. Bass didn't hear the actual words. He stared at the plain coffin, thinking about the man inside. 19 when he killed James in panic. 31 when tuberculosis killed him in a prison cell. 12 years between those moments, haunted every single night by one terrible decision made in fear. The prayer ended. Silence settled over the hillside except for wind through oak branches. The warden gestured awkwardly toward the grave. "Marshal, if you'd like to say something over him." Bass shook his head. No speech, no sermon, no final words. He knelt in the dirt beside the coffin, placed the silver watch on the raw pine lid. The metal gleamed against rough wood. One guard standing nearby whispered to his partner, That's evidence from the trial. Family heirloom. Why would he bury it with the killer? Bass heard, but didn't turn around. He stood, stepped back from the grave. The burial workers moved forward and began lowering the coffin on ropes. As the coffin descended into darkness, Bass felt something break loose inside his chest. Not grief. He'd grieved James 12 years ago at a different grave. This was something else entirely. The weight he'd carried since 1883. The hate that had sharpened every manhunt. The obsession that had driven him through impossible odds and nearly gotten him killed a dozen times. All of it releasing like water through a broken dam. He stood at the grave's edge watching dirt fall onto the coffin, onto the watch, burying both together. Tears ran down his weathered face. He didn't wipe them away or hide them. The deputies and guards stared in shock. Floyd Wilson had ridden with Bass for 5 years, through the most dangerous situations in Indian Territory. Shootouts, ambushes, tracking killers through winter storms. He'd never seen Bass Reeves cry. Not once. Not after burying fellow marshals, not after the worst days, not ever. But here, standing at his brother's killer's grave, Bass wept openly. The warden approached quietly, uncertain. "Marshal, are you all right? Do you need—" Bass raised one hand to stop him. "I'm fine." His voice was steady despite the tears. "I gave my word I'd come. I kept it." The coffin settled at the grave bottom with a hollow thump. Workers shoveled dirt. The silver watch disappeared beneath clay and rocks and earth. Bass watched until the grave was completely filled, a mound of fresh dirt marking the spot. No headstone would be placed. No marker. Just dirt and grass eventually. He turned to walk back to his horse. Floyd caught up, confused and concerned. "Marshal, I don't understand. You hunted that man for 12 years. Why bury the watch with him?" Bass mounted his horse, looked back at the unmarked grave one final time. "Hate kept me hunting, Floyd. Forgiveness lets me rest." The ride back to Fort Smith took 2 full days. Bass rode slowly with no urgency driving him forward. The same trails he'd crossed hundreds of times chasing fugitives, always moving fast, always driven by duty or that 12-year need for justice. Now he rode for himself. The watch was gone. James was gone. Webb was gone. All that remained was the weight of his decision, to honor a dying killer's final request, to bury evidence with the murderer's body, to choose mercy when vengeance would have been easier and more satisfying. When Bass reached Fort Smith on the 3rd day, the story had already spread through the Marshal service. Some deputies openly questioned his judgment, called it weakness, said he'd betrayed James's memory by showing kindness to his brother's murderer. Others saw something deeper, a man strong enough to choose forgiveness when hate was the expected path. Bass didn't defend himself to anyone, didn't explain his reasoning. He returned to his office, filed his standard reports, and continued his marshal work. But something had fundamentally changed in how people perceived him. Chapter 10. 210 Words. Before the burial, Bass Reeves had been seen as the unbreakable lawman. Perfect arrest record, no visible weakness, no doubt, no mercy for criminals. A legend built on being harder than the hardest outlaws. Now people saw him as human, capable of mercy, capable of tears, capable of choosing grace over vengeance. His legend didn't diminish. It transformed into something more complex. Not just arrests and shootouts, but humanity and moral courage. Floyd Wilson told people later, "Bass Reeves taught me that law isn't just about catching criminals and putting them in cells. It's about understanding what justice really means when you strip away revenge. In the months following Webb's burial, Bass continued his usual work patterns across Indian Territory. The arrests continued. The courtroom testimony continued. But colleagues noticed subtle changes in how he operated. He talked less about punishment, more about second chances, especially with young offenders. When he brought in a 19-year-old kid caught rustling horses, Bass looked at him hard and said, "You're 19. Same age as a man I knew once. He made one bad choice in a moment of fear. Spent 12 years drowning in regret over it. Don't be him. Choose different." The kid served 8 months, came out different, went straight. Word spread through Indian Territory's outlaw networks. Bass Reeves wasn't just the toughest marshal. He was the fairest. Men who might have fought to the death surrendered to him instead. They knew he'd bring them in alive if possible, treat them with dignity even in chains, give them a chance at something better than a bullet or a noose. His arrest record remained perfect, and his reputation for toughness never wavered. But the legend evolved beyond simple fear. Stories circulated about the watch, the grave, the tears. Some versions got details wrong, claimed Bass and Webb were childhood friends, or that Webb had saved Bass's life once in the past. The truth was simpler and harder to grasp. Bass chose to honor a promise to a dying man who'd murdered his brother. That choice rippled outward in ways he never intended. Changed how people thought about justice and mercy and what it meant to be a lawman with actual principles. One evening in late 1895, Bass rode home alone through Creek Nation territory, watching the sun set behind him. He reached instinctively for his pocket watch to check the time, then remembered it wasn't there anymore. Buried in an unmarked grave. Years after Bass Reeves retired from the Marshal service, the story became legend. People told it differently each time. Some said the watch was solid gold. Others claimed Webb and Bass met privately before the burial and reconciled. A few insisted Bass had forgiven Webb years earlier and the grave visit was pure ceremony. The truth was simpler. A dying man asked for mercy from the brother of the man he'd killed. Bass Reeves, the most feared lawman in Indian Territory, chose to grant it. The grave remains unmarked in that pauper's cemetery near Fort Smith. Visitors sometimes search for it, looking for where Bass Reeves buried his brother's watch with his brother's killer. They rarely find it, but the story endures. Bass Reeves buried the hatchet, people still say across Oklahoma and Arkansas. The watch stayed in the ground with Jim Webb's bones. The grudge stayed buried too. Bass lived the rest of his life lighter than before, though he never spoke publicly about that day. The empty space on his vest where the watch used to hang remained empty, a deliberate choice, a reminder that some things are meant to be released rather than replaced. In his final years, when young marshals asked about his legendary career, Bass would sometimes mention the hardest arrest he ever made. Not the most dangerous, not the most famous, the hardest. Arresting your hate, he'd say quietly, and letting it go. Justice catches you eventually. Forgiveness frees you both.